Welcome to Let's Talk Health, powered by VitifyHealth. I'm your host, Miles Wingfield. Today, we're joined by a visionary leader who spent over 2 decades redefining what's possible in clinical research. From his early days as a coordinator to founding Cedar Health Research and now serving as a principal consultant, he's built and scaled some of the most respected site networks in the country. A passionate advocate for representation in trials and a forward thinker on the role of AI in healthcare. He's made it his mission to build trust with underserved communities and modernize how research gets done. Please welcome Todd Albin. Todd, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great today, Miles. Great to be here.
Yeah, I think great to have you. And I'd like to just get straight into it. You've held many roles in clinical research, from coordinator to site director to CEO. What inspired you to enter this industry?
I came through an untraditional background, which I think was kind of common for folks who came up during the time period, which was the 90s. For me, I was working for a group medical practice in a marketing and operations role, and they decided they wanted to get involved in clinical research and tapped me to find their first research study. And when we did, I was then tapped with kind of operationalizing the function within the practice, and that was my introduction into clinical research. And as I was, scaling that out and also, working within practice operations and marketing and business development, I was completing my master's degree. And at that time, I saw, managed care really sinking their teeth into healthcare administration. And I had to really choose, did I want to focus on healthcare administration or clinical research? And I was just much more excited, much more interested around the clinical research field. So made a full pivot into roles after that point. That led me into leveraging what was a business background, but applying it into the clinical research space, specifically around community site operations and patient recruitment.
Yeah, definitely. I find that pivot into clinical research and leveraging that all the way to becoming a CEO of your own site network to be really inspiring. And so, what motivated you to found Cedar Health Research, and what were some of the early challenges you faced in building your own site network from the ground up?
Yeah, certainly. So Cedar Health Research was really born out of a tech initiative initially, a group of investors, paired with some data scientists out of Lockheed Martin and formed a company called Aspen Insights. And they were really looking. This is in 2019, before AI really hit the scene as far as having applications in clinical research, at least widespread. But they wanted to understand how technology that these folks have been working on in the defense and intelligence sector could be applied towards solving some of the patient recruitment problems that are only growing around clinical research. And myself, I've always chased innovation in patient recruitment throughout my career. So I looked at this as an intriguing approach. This idea that we could use AI with looking at both structured and unstructured health records to be able to inform study design, feasibility, and ultimately matching patients to complex trials. Understood that they needed really to execute this within a site network to really demonstrate its value. So that's where I got tapped in to build Cedar, and really wanted to approach this using my prior 25 years of experience in operations and at sites and patient recruitment to really
Mhm.
build out a site network that I thought was going to be dynamic, and really show how this technology can be leveraged to solve complex recruitment challenges on protocols, but also expand clinical trial access to underrepresented populations. So, we took a unique spin about it where we partnered with healthcare providers. Some of them are research naive, some of them attempted to work in research before, realized it was far more than they bargained with. There's a very common statistic that a lot of physicians do one trial and they're done because they think it's an attractive thing to add to their practice and a new revenue stream. But once they get into it, they realize all of the regulatory components, the trial complexity, all of those burdens on top of running a practice in today's challenging environment was more than they bargained for. So in our model, we partnered with these physician practices, use the technology to lower the burdens of identifying patients, but then work with them as their offsite research department, being able to offer trials but execute them without putting a burden on the practice, and doing this through a coordination of care model. And this allowed us to, through 4 established sites, be able to source patients from over 150 practices in the highly diverse areas around North Texas and in Midland, Texas as well.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. Obviously, very similar goal to what we share here at Vitify Health. And obviously, you said that you've helped, I guess, just reduce their workflows to increase representation in trial. But why isn't representation in clinical trials so important in your mind? And how can you, again, even further leverage AI in the next, say, 5 to 10 years to increase its representation in these trials?
Yeah, so when it comes to underrepresentation in clinical trials, I think it has there's lots of reasons for it, but going back to your initial question in terms of why it's important, it's got a very it's really foundationally based in science and safety. The fact that clinical trials are traditionally conducted on a smaller representation of the population to begin with, before the FDA approves it and makes these medications available to potentially hundreds of thousands or millions of people, depending on the disease state worldwide. But if the participants in those trials don't represent the different racial and ethnic genetic diversity that exists out there, then there's a lot that isn't learned about the potential safety and benefits of these medications. And what we've learned is that these compounds, and as we're getting into more genomic related clinical trial development and more personalized medicine, it has wide varying impacts for someone who might be coming from an Asian or Black or an American Indian ethnicity or racial or ethnicity. That's going to look very different. So having these folks be part of these trials in larger numbers is critically important to having a better safety and efficacy profile on the drugs. But the problem is traditionally they've been underrepresented. There's a great deal of distrust and lack of awareness within these communities. Because of this, their physicians haven't been participating as investigators, and that's really the best route that these patients get to be offered trials, is when it's brought to them through that trusted relationship through their healthcare provider. So if the providers aren't offering the trials, likelihood is there are very few of them will actually find their way into these trials.
Yeah, definitely. So, and one thing you mentioned is that big lack of trust. So, how do you think clinical research professionals can help, I guess, rebuild this bridge, rebuild this trust between these communities? Because, as you said, it's so important that they're represented within these trials.
It all comes down to education and awareness, and really breaking down the barriers and the misconceptions. Obviously there were some terrible things done to a lot of these communities when you look back historically, both in clinical research and just in general. Where powerful forces, government or businesses, took advantage of different groups there. So inherently there's a lot of distrust there. But the first piece of it there is really communicating through trusted relationships they've already have, which in this case is usually their physician providers that are within these same communities. That when those providers believe in clinical research, as potentially a care option, but it is a legitimate ethical pathway for these patients to get access to advancing medications and help move these medications for approvals. Using volunteers from these communities, that's a big piece. And then providing the educational materials and forums that will allow for these communities to be able to understand more about what clinical research is, what protections are in place that can prevent some of the abuses that happened in the past, how IRBs work, the role of ethics and all of these aspects that have come into play, since a lot of those past incidents have occurred. And then most importantly, not doing it on a transactional per study basis, that, really, leveraging true engagement, working with these communities long term in terms of making them aware of clinical research, so that when there is a particular trial, you're not just approaching them transactionally to fill enrollment on a particular trial, but that they build a long-term trusted relationship, considering clinical research through their provider for themselves and their friends and their families as well.
Yeah, I think the point you bring up of building a long-term relationship versus a transactional one is one that's really powerful, and one that I actually want to continue with me is on as I continue my own career. And just to shift the conversation back to something earlier you said about partnering with these local physicians and leveraging the AI with them. How open have you seen these local physicians be to AI as it again becomes more adoptable in the healthcare industry?
I would say it's been evolving, right? So I think when we first started talking to physicians, folks who weren't that aware of it, certainly had their concerns about it, and being really able to understand and speak to them about how the healthcare data is critically important to protect. Obviously, there are laws around that, but understanding that how we manage the data in a way that is compliant, both in terms of cybersecurity, but also in terms of healthcare privacy and HIPAA compliance, is very important, and to be very clear about how that's done and how that's managed. so that, when you're using these tools to interface with this very sensitive data, that there isn't a way that this data could get exposed or shared to folks who don't have authorization to see that. So I
Mhm.
think that that's the really big piece of it. And then secondary to that is to really work with them to say that, this is not a silver bullet. This isn't going to serve up the perfectly matched patient, but what it's going to do for you is going to, instead of you having to look at, hundreds of charts to find the patients that match, or having your nursing staff do that, it's going to curate for you the patients that are most likely to qualify, cut out a lot of that waste of time so that you can focus your efforts just looking at really, who is most likely to qualify, and then consider those for those trials. And as long as you don't, you can demonstrate how you're protecting the data, protecting privacy, and that, you're managing expectations that it's not going to solve all your problems in an instant, that allows that to happen. And we had more success with physicians who own their own practice, who were the decision makers around their technology. It gets a little bit more challenging when you're trying to engage with larger health systems that have their own IT departments, that might be looking to develop themselves, or because their systems are so big, they're just very sensitive about letting another technology in, that could potentially expose their larger system to risk, even if you can mitigate for that risk. So, but these practices that tend to, operate in these underserved communities, a lot of them are smaller physician-owned practices. And if you have, the right education around what this looks like for them, it really opens up their idea that they think like, okay, this is going to allow me to actually be part of clinical research, where before it was far more than I could manage.
Definitely, that makes a lot of sense. I think from me building within this space, one of the biggest things that I've seen, not only is from the data privacy, but the amount of fragmentation within the tech stacks for these different clinical researchers, right? And it's that they'll have 13 different technologies with 13 different logins, and you have to input information manually into it. So how did you navigate within that, knowing that trying to integrate within these workflows, is it direct integration within EMR records, or was it a different solution that you found?
So we accomplished it mostly through API integrations, working through the EMR companies, and that's a challenging environment because, where, the EMR companies are they are their sites, their practices are their customers, and we're coming in as kind of a third party. They can't block access to the data, and they have to facilitate it, but the level of support they have to provide around that, can be sometimes pretty minimal. So more success than others depending on that EMR provider. But the more tech forward they are, they can make it look very easy, where it can be very turnkey. The key thing is that, setting it up so it doesn't at all interfere or push anything into the workflow of the provider, unless that's something the provider asks for. It really all happens behind the scenes, a way to look at the data and identify those best patients, and then have a way to curate those to the providers. That's really simple, and having a simple login to say, okay, these are your patients that match this protocol. Here's the protocol, here are the patients, and make that easier. And then on the research site side, again, that's where we're dealing with 13 to 15 portals per study, and managing that for our team. It was important for us to integrate with our CTMS provider, so that the patients that were identified and approved by their physicians could flow right into our recruitment flow for our team to do the outreach, onto those patients, to assess their interest in moving forward with the trial.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that insight. And lastly, for someone looking to break into clinical research today, whether as a coordinator, entrepreneur, or even an advocate, what would be your best piece of advice?
I would say, be prepared to be resilient. That this is a incredibly rewarding field to work in, but it's also an incredibly challenging field with a lot of conflicting, interest on your time and what you're doing. And the key thing is stay focused on what you're looking to achieve, and understand that you're going to have to collaborate with across a lot of different experts in a lot of different areas to be successful, and keeping an open mind, and not getting frustrated and beaten down when things don't work. I like to say, we wouldn't call it research if we knew what we were doing. And that's
Right.
that that resonates for me every day when you're in the trenches fighting the fires. It doesn't work perfectly. You're working with a lot of different stakeholders, leveraging a lot of technology, but keeping the patient in the center of everything you're doing, and the best interest for the patient as you're moving it forward, and doing that in a safe and compliant way. You can be assured that things will come out right for you in the end. So focusing on the patient patient, being resilient, understanding that it's not going to work perfectly, that these solutions are going to be clunky and things are going to break. But ultimately, if you're doing it for the right reasons, which is to help advance life-changing therapies and help get them to markets faster and in the hands of patients at a lower cost, and keeping that in mind throughout what you're doing, that's where you can get the ultimate reward for that, and not let all of the other things that go on in this industry, frustrate you or beat you down. So, that's kind of a broader answer to that. There's not a single thing to say, but I would say resilience and patient centricity gets you through the hard times, and it can be very rewarding, which it's been for me throughout my 28 years in the business.
Yeah, thank you for that, Todd. And well, ladies and gentlemen, that's all the time we have today. This has been Let's Talk Health, powered by VitifyHealth. If you're interested in learning more about Todd Albin and his impactful work or the work we do here at VitifyHealth, feel free to check us out in the links in the description. Thank you, and we'll see you soon. Thank you, Todd.
Thank you, Miles. Appreciate it.